Hello and welcome to the Psychology in Schools team podcast on spotting the signs of stress in your child. I'm Dr. Beth Mosley, a clinical psychologist. Joining me for this podcast is Tamara Scully.
Hello.
And Linda Brendel.
Hello.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge we're entering this second lockdown and there may well be mixed feelings about it. Some of our children are going to be really grateful that schools are still open, and some of our children might have been quite looking forward to having a bit of more time off school. But I think for all of us, we're really feeling that kind of fatigue effect, the fed upness, and we're wondering how much longer we can sustain this level of uncertainty. And I think one of the things that as a parent we might be particularly worried about is how do we notice the sort of signs of symptoms of stress in our children? How do we know that they're big enough to warrant extra help? And what do we do as a parent really when our children are struggling to cope with these unusual times? So that's the topic for our podcast today. And we're going to try and keep this short and sweet. And we're going to think about sort of 7 areas really that might be the key symptoms or indicators of stress in young people. So Tamara, what would you say is one of the key signs of stress that we might need to look out for in our children, no matter what their age?
I think one of the key signs that we need to be mindful of is any kind of changes in their behaviour. I guess what we know about anxiety is that it can be very sneaky, and often it doesn't present in the stereotypical way we kind of imagine it's going to present. So children feeling kind of breathing more quickly and their heart rate speeding up. So I guess one of the main things that we need to look out for as parents is any changes in their behaviour. We know that anxiety can often be lurking in disguise. It doesn't always present in the way we expect it to present in. And I suppose within this context, one of the big changes is we can often experience our young people presenting with lots of different big feelings. So I guess what I mean by this is sometimes they can present with a lot of anger and frustration. Sometimes they can present with a lot of sadness. And I suppose in some senses, this makes a lot of sense, because when we're feeling anxious, I guess what we want to do is kind of alert those people around us. And one way that we can alert the people around us is by expressing those big feelings. And, I guess what's important as parents is that we are kind of taking the time to think about what might be beneath those feelings. Actually, those behaviours might be driven more by anxiety. So I'm not sure if anyone in the team kind of has an example where there is a change in their behaviour.
Well, I'm just thinking about my son who's 8 and how he's so much less able to tolerate the usual kind of jibing he gets from his older sister. And literally, he, instead of kind of coping with her making a comment or antagonizing him, which she's really great at doing, and he's normally quite good at putting up with that. But now what he does is he has this massive explosion of complete rage. And it literally happens the second that she starts to aggravate him. And his whole body gets turned into a kind of about to erupt volcano. And what he wants to do is actually hit out and immediately try and fight her, really. And the difficulty with this behaviour is that it leads to an escalation in things in the household very, very quickly, because you're angry with the older child for antagonising the younger child that is feeling a bit more sensitive at the moment and could normally cope with this kind of thing. And this is something that I've noticed has just been happening more recently. And as a parent, it's making me think, oh, what does this mean? What do I do to manage this situation? Because actually what happens is he ends up hitting his sister and then she gets upset that he's not in trouble for hitting her. So you kind of can see how these changes in behaviours can easily lead to more challenges within the family dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I guess something that's really helpful to hold in mind is, when he just has that massive explosion, actually in that moment, there's not an awful lot that you can do to kind of to reason with him and think about things in a different way. You almost need to just kind of allow him to come down from the explosion and get back into a more reasoned place before you can kind of start thinking about that with him. But I think that's a really nice example. I guess the other thing, kind of the other side of this, is you'll also often have children who really withdraw. So you'll notice that they're beginning to kind of spend way more time in their bedrooms. They might be spending way more time on screens, playing computer games. And I suppose this is essentially kind of the flight part of our fight, flight, freeze response. And, it makes lots of sense when there's lots of things in our world that are kind of changing and we don't have a lot of control over it. Often the way that we try and manage that is to try and kind of take ourselves away and to withdraw. And, a certain amount of that is okay. I guess when we get concerned is when the level of withdrawal that they're engaging in, it's kind of stopping them from doing those other important things that are kind of helpful for their well-being. And I guess as parents, it's just kind of validating and saying, oh, I noticed that you're spending like an awful lot more time in your room at the moment, and recognizing that there's a lot of uncertainty around at the moment. And then maybe just taking some really small steps, so that they're kind of doing maybe one thing in the evening with their family, or they're having one communication with someone, one of their peer groups. That can be kind of helpful around that.
I think, Tamara, another thing I've noticed is my daughter just kind of wanting to be near me a lot more and kind of not leaving my side, which actually she's a pretty confident girl actually, but it's just that kind of just following me around, doing her thing on her TikTok or whatever it is, but just she's tracking me around the house a lot and wanting to sleep in my bed, getting into my bed at bedtime and kind of wanting to draw out the bedtime process. So I wonder if that's something that we might notice in young people, that kind of increase in clinginess or sort of feeling that they need a bit more reassurance.
Yeah, and we're, again, like with the other two behaviors we've talked about, this one makes an awful lot of sense. I mean, we're wired to kind of feel safest when we're close to our people and that are important to us. And I guess for the most part, if parents are able to kind of spend a little bit more time or tolerate a little bit more closeness from their young people, because, what we know is that when we're close to the people that are really important to us, oxytocin gets released. And we know that oxytocin is really powerful in terms of reducing the level of anxiety that they're experiencing. So although it can feel really tricky sometimes when you feel like you have no breathing space for yourself, but actually if you are able to build in that kind of extra closeness with your child, it is a really helpful way of kind of calming down their threat system.
And I think what I've been trying to do is keep those boundaries in place. So she this kind of wanting to be in my bed, I've really kind of moved her, that boundary, and no, you'll find you can sleep in your own bed. Let's sit in your bed and watch Riverdale or whatever we're watching together before you go to sleep, so we don't get sucked into that challenge where young people kind of start new habits and routines that become really difficult to break. And I guess there's something about me being reassuring in that I am not going to be changing my behaviour too much to accommodate an anxiety which is natural but maybe is unnecessary for me to be too available, if that makes sense, because in some ways it might feed into that feeling for her that there is something wrong, because for us right now there's a lot going on in the world out there, but actually for my family things are pretty stable at the moment, and I think for her she really needs those boundaries to continue, because if they don't, she sort of feels like she's going to take more and more control in our family. So it's a really hard line to get that line between being available, offering that kind of care, but also being quite firm still around those important boundaries that symbolize, you know, bedtimes, when we eat our meals, and when actually I need some space and time, because often I do, in order to kind of, you know, feel okay myself to manage all of this stuff. And I guess that's such a tricky dynamic, isn't it, as a parent, balancing that.
It is. And, you know, one of the things that I read from a clinical psychologist based in Australia, but she came up with this kind of nice idea of yes, yes, no. And the idea is, yes, it's, you know, it's okay to feel the feelings that you're feeling. And yes, it's okay for you to express those feelings. But no, it's not okay for you to kind of hit your sister or shout at me, or so it's very much kind of connecting, doing that connection piece and kind of saying, yes, your feelings are okay, but also, I suppose, holding the boundary and saying, but actually this part is not okay. So it's a useful kind of thing just to hold in mind, just this idea of yes, yes, no, as a way of kind of maybe managing some of that.
That's really helpful.
I guess one thing I was just thinking when you're saying your example, Beth, is that of course we do know that it will be very normal for our young people to be feeling like they need something extra. So whilst you're trying to negotiate and work out those boundaries, you're also trying to be flexible and give your daughter something extra that she needs at the moment, in a time where she's not feeling so emotionally contained, perhaps more from the external things outside of her immediate world, but she's aware of that uncertainty of knowing what's going to happen in the future that none of us have at the moment. So you allowing yourself to meet part way with her to try and support her and help support those emotions seems like that's that sort of balance that you're trying to work on. Having your breathing space, but also recognizing her increased need at the moment to feel secure within her home environment.
That's really helpful. I'm just curious about some of the other things that we might want to look out for in our young people. I'm wondering about sleep. What do we need to look out for with regard to sleep?
I guess the things that we look out for are things like sleeping a lot more or a lot less than usual, or, you know, kids who are really struggling to get to sleep at night, or maybe they are able to get to sleep, but actually they're waking up kind of a number of times through the night. And I guess, you know, for younger children, sometimes they can just find it really difficult to settle kind of in the evening, and even in the run up to bedtime, they can you can often see kind of some difficult behaviours linked in with the anxiety about kind of going up to bed. And, you know, I guess the really important thing to kind of hold in mind around sleep is that we are really clear from the research that when our kids or ourselves aren't getting enough sleep, our capacity to manage any kind of anxiety the next day is really diminished. So it's certainly something I think that is worth kind of thinking about and talking about within your families. And you know, there are things that can be really helpful in terms of going to sleep, just doing kind of some belly breathing before you go to sleep, or maybe some mindfulness. And there's loads of lovely apps out there that young people can access, like Smiling Mind or Headspace, and that can really just create a good routine around sleep. And I suppose the other two things that kind of link into that in a way are changes in eating patterns. So you'll often notice children eating more or eating less of what they would normally be eating. And certainly what parents are also talking about is changes in self-care. So young people not taking care of their appearance in the way that they normally would, and just generally kind of showing less interest in kind of personal hygiene. But I suppose around each of these three things, the important point to make is that, you know, noticing some changes in these areas is perfectly normal. You know, we are in the middle of a pandemic. It is really normal to be experiencing some level of anxiety that might manifest in these areas. I guess what we're interested in terms of recognizing a greater level of stress that might need some support is when it's much more pronounced and it's going on for a longer period of time.
Okay, that's really helpful. And we have done a sleep podcast actually, which might be helpful for families where sleep is a current issue. So one of the other areas is potentially, I'm guessing, like a change in interest in activities, and maybe young people, things that they previously really enjoyed, just being reluctant to do them anymore. And I've been really lucky. My son absolutely loves football, and going back into football after lockdown, he's just completely gone in there, and he's been really loving it. And actually it's one of the real losses for him coming out, going back into lockdown again. But I guess for some young people, those things that they were really motivated by and enjoyed, they may have really struggled to get back into. So what would you say your advice would be really with families who might be noticing that their children aren't doing the things that they used to enjoy doing, and they think it's because of anxiety or stress?
I guess there's two kind of parts to this. I think the first part is that very real recognition that actually they are not going to have access to many of those extracurricular activities, hopefully for not a really long period of time, but for a period of time nevertheless. So I think it's really helpful for families just to think about how some of those gaps can be filled with alternative activities. So it might be, you know, going for walks on the weekend. It might be kind of making things as a family. And it just kind of creating maybe some of the structure that's been lost from those activities. But I guess the other thing that I think is important to hold in mind around extracurricular activities is that, you know, for many young people, this is how they kind of manage a lot of stress and tension. So they get out on the football pitch and they're able to kind of run for an hour with their friends. And actually, you know, because one of the things that happens with anxiety is our body gets surged with all of these neurochemicals. And actually movement is an incredibly helpful strategy. So when that coping strategy gets lost, what can happen is it can be replaced with much more unhelpful coping strategies. You know, and in some cases, I guess kids will kind of drink more alcohol, or they will spend really excessive amounts of time on screens and on social media. So I guess if you're a parent that kind of knows that your son, their well-being generally is much better when they're playing football, and they're not able to play football now, it's just kind of just being mindful that actually they've lost the thing that was helping them to manage, and making sure that you're kind of thinking with them and trying to provide opportunities for them to have other healthy outlets.
Okay, that really makes sense. And I guess the last thing, the seventh thing really is when we really notice that kind of change in mood and thinking patterns. So that sort of hopelessness, that feeling constantly low, just that sense that the young person feels unable to cope with any of those usual things really. And I guess for any parent, it's really worrying, isn't it, when our young people get to that place, and we're witnessing a lot of that on the news at the moment, aren't we, sometimes, that kind of catastrophic thinking, and we might be feeling like that ourselves. So I think that's probably an area really that where we're looking not just at anxiety, but we might also be worrying about the young person's sort of feelings of low mood there as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think this is a really tricky one, you know, particularly for our adolescents. And I think, you know, as parents, you know, sometimes I will talk to parents and they'll be like, well, I don't know kind of how their thought processes have changed, or I don't know what they're thinking. And I guess, again, it's, for me, it kind of comes back to looking at the behaviors that you are able to observe. and maybe just giving them the opportunity to kind of talk about the things that are tricky for them. And by saying, you know, I notice that you seem to be feeling really down at the moment. I just wonder if there's anything that I can do to help. Because even if at that point the young person isn't able to respond to you, what you're essentially doing is you're letting them know that you're there. You're letting them know that you see them. And that in itself is incredibly validating, and it's very containing. So I think, you know, often when we feel like, well, we don't have the skills and we don't know what to do, but actually some of this is just about being human. It's just about being kind, and it's just about keeping your eyes open and noticing when things are changing and letting them know that you're there.
And I guess we can expect that we're all going to be on a bit of a roller coaster ride. So we might see that this kind of feeling overwhelmed by hopelessness comes in part of the day. But then we see young people kind of get back to their normal self. And I guess that we kind of have to expect we're going to have more of these peaks and troughs during this time. But in terms of thinking about when do I really need to worry more as a parent or look out for more help for my young person, I guess it's when we're seeing that mood being really persistent across time and context. So they're not just presenting like that at home at the end of a long day at school, but also the school teacher might be saying, oh, I'm a bit worried that Tommy seems really kind of not contributing in lessons, really difficult for him to he's not really relating to his friends anymore. And so I think that's when we as parents might be thinking, oh, this is extending beyond that kind of roller coaster ride of life at the moment, and it's really persistent. Linda, in terms of thinking, what do we do as a parent when we might start noticing these changes in behaviour? Have you got some kind of simple take-home advice?
Yes, I mean, I guess actually what Tamara and Beth, you've already been talking about is really keeping the lines open of communication as much as you can with your child and allowing them to talk about how they're feeling. This is a key message because this helps us to really have a chance to understand what's going on for them. And this will give us a good pointer as if there's something we need to be more concerned about and need to seek extra support, or if indeed this is something that you can just help support your young person with, along with friends and family and perhaps even school staff. So I guess a key thing to know when you're speaking with your child is, rather than trying to automatically solve all their problems, just to listen and hear what they've got to say. Try and understand what's going on for them, and show that you recognize what they're saying is important for them and significant. Doing this alone can help your child to really feel heard and therefore also have their emotions feel held. And this in itself can reduce a sense of distress, feeling of overwhelmedness or hopelessness. So actually the importance of listening can't be underestimated. I think that's a key message, to listen and really hear what your child is saying, and try and put yourself in their shoes so that you can connect to what's going on for them. When your child might be feeling that arousal, that physical arousal of sort of stress and anxiety that Tamara spoke about earlier, then that might be a time to also support them in using some very practical techniques, either using the apps that Tamara mentioned or helping to support your child to do some deep belly breathing, some mindfulness, or some progressive muscular relaxation. All of those things can help calm the physical arousal and take the body out of that fight, flight, I always get this muddled, fight, flight, or freeze response that our body is automatically, instinctively moving into. So actually, if we can help support our children to learn and practice any one of those skills, of which you can see lots of examples of how to do these things online, you can actively support your child to learn skills that will help settle them in the moment. And once they're more settled, they probably will be in a better place to start speaking to you, and then you can listen to them. And it might be that later on you will need to help support them in problem solving some of the challenges they've got, if indeed they are challenges that can be problem solved. But the key first things are to remember to help support them to calm their physiological, emotional sort of experiences, and to validate their feelings. I guess just one of the last key things to say is that we know that in this very unusual time that we're all having to tolerate uncertainty, perhaps like we've never expected before in all different aspects of our lives. There's been changes at home and school, but also in our social environment as well. And recognising that it is an uncertain time, it is our natural response to choose to avoid things that feel difficult. But what we do know is that if we can learn to accept and go with what's going on at the moment, that will help us to cope better with it, to be more adaptable. Sounds very easy to say and can feel very tricky to do, but I guess trying to support our children to sit with and manage their difficult feelings that they're having can actually be more helpful in the long term than just trying to distract them away from them straight away. What we know is that if we notice these difficult feelings, over time, whilst we don't sit with them for a long time, we can notice them and then refocus onto something else that's important to us. That noticing and pushing difficult feelings away that will pop up later, but it will help us to gradually learn to cope better with those difficult feelings. So this is a big area to think about, but if we can help support our children to tolerate this uncertain time, we will actually be supporting them to develop some really good skills of managing change, being flexible, are skills which they'll be able to use for the rest of their lives. And I guess this is an example of learning how to develop more resilience.
Thank you, Linda. That's amazing. And I guess it's important to say that on the NSFT YouTube channel, there's quite a lot of resources that we put together for parents, teachers and young people on managing anxiety. And the Suffolk Wellbeing website has got lots of resources and signposting to help parents and young people think about how they can support themselves. And there's always the Emotional Wellbeing Gateway if you feel like your child might need more help. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, everybody.